Hi, it's Heather from Thicketworks, and today I'll be making this set of miniature medieval tableware fit for a banquet. To do this, I'll be using the Cricut Maker and 65-pound cardstock, in addition to a lot of glue and some finishing techniques. At the end of the process, I end up with 6 trenchers, 2 serving platters, a serving fork, a carving knife, a serving spoon, 6 medieval goblets, and 6 individual prickers, the precursor to today's fork, and 6 individual eating knives. You can download your free SVG bundle by following the link in the description. I'm going to begin by creating the 2 serving platters and the 6 individual trenchers. This little piece will act as a support, but the 2 circles cut from the center of it aren't necessary. You can set those aside. Before I begin building the individual pieces, I'm going to put together this little support system. This frame will help me to create more uniform trenchers. So I'm just layering those 2 pieces together and setting them aside. Now I'm going to begin constructing the individual trenchers. I begin this process by placing the ring-shaped frame onto the trencher base without gluing it down, and then adding adhesive to the back of the smaller disc and centering it within the frame. Now I'm going to layer these 2 larger discs together. I'll do my best to line them up with each other, and then it's time to begin layering on the ringed frame. This goes on top. Again, I work hard to make sure that the edges are lined up as well as I can do it. And then I pop this piece into the little framework we created, and I'm using a ball stylus to reinforce the shape of the center of each trencher. This process is repeated with all of the pieces. I place the smaller disc on the bottom, layer the 2 larger discs together, then I layer the ring-shaped frame on the very upper surface and align the edges to the best of my ability before reinforcing the shape using the ball stylus. A very similar method is used to construct the 2 serving platters. But this time I begin the process by layering together the 2 smaller lozenge shapes. Once I've done that, and used a brayer to ensure that they are properly glued down, I center the frame around the outside of the larger lozenge shape, and then insert the double layer we've just created inside of that frame and remove the frame once the placement is complete. Then I flip the piece over and I apply the frames to the larger lozenge shape, creating a sort of lip effect around the exterior of each of the platters. You can layer these 2 frames together prior to applying them, or you can do what you see me doing here, which is adding one at a time. Lining up the edges, pressing everything in place, and again I'll use a ball stylus to reinforce the line of demarcation between the lip and the bottom of the platter. Then I'll repeat this process for the other platter. Now that the trenchers and platters are complete, I'm turning my attention to the serving pieces, and I begin this process by gluing together 2 layers of 65-pound cardstock that has been cut into the shape of this large serving spoon. Using a pair of fine-tipped tweezers helps me to, as accurately as I can, line up all of the contours so that as I build up the 4 layers of paper, the overall shape remains the same. Once those 4 layers have been thoroughly glued together, I begin the process of gently pressing a rounded shape into the bowl of the spoon. And now I'm going to begin creating the scales, or the pieces that create the thickness for the handle. There are 8 of these, 4 of which will be placed on either side of the existing handle to create a total of 12 thicknesses of paper. I've just joined 3 together, and now I'm adding the final 4th, lining everything up with the fine tip tweezers, and I'll repeat that process with the other scale. Before these are attached, I'm going to be adding what's known as the bolster. This is a kind of ridge that rests around the base of each handle. Now, you can put these tiny ovals together any way you like. I found it easiest to work with 2 layers at a time. And using a needle tool and the fine tip tweezer really helps keep them aligned. At this point, I want to insert the butt of the handle into one of these little bolsters. And then using my tweezers, I slide it all the way down until it can't go any further. I apply a little bit of adhesive and then add the second double stack of cut bolster pieces right on top, and then press them firmly together. Once that's done, I can begin experimenting with curving the handle of the spoon. So far, so good. Now it's time to add the scales on either side of the handle. Press them firmly in place and align the exterior contours as closely as possible. It's not always easy when working at this small scale. Okay, now that the first one's in place, I'm adding the second set of scales. And now we have a very substantial handle, and we can work on making that curve just a little more graceful. Yep, I'm pretty happy with that. Excellent. At this stage, I'm going to begin hardening the layers of cardstock using water-thin superglue. That's superglue that's as thin as water. Next up, I'll be assembling the carving knife. And the carving knife is a little bit different. It consists of 2 knife blades that are the center layers, 2 knife blades that are slightly narrower that are the outer layers, and this helps to create a tapered blade. I'm going to begin this construction by layering together the 2 center parts of the blade. These are the ones that are slightly wider. Okay, so I've placed one layer on top of the other. I'm aligning the edges, and now I'm going to adhere one of the more narrow blade pieces, one on either side of the 2 center layers. It's important during this process to make certain that the upper layer is aligned with the flat, straight part of the blade, so that along the curved edge there is a slight reveal of the underlying layers like this. It's this slight reveal that's going to create the illusion of a tapered knife blade. Once the first side has been adhered into place, I'll repeat the same process on the other side, again taking care to align the flat, straight side of the blade while leaving a small reveal along the curved edge. That completes the knife blade portion of this construction. Now I'm putting together the scales, and they consist of 4 layers of cardstock. There are a total of 8 of these scale pieces. They get glued together in layers of 4, and then each of those will eventually be glued on either side of the hilt. But before that takes place, it's time to create the bolsters. These are the most finicky parts of the build, and I find that working with a needle tool is invaluable when I'm layering these tiny little oval frame shapes. I then place them on a piece of foam so that there's a bit of resilience there, and I do my best to flatten the butt end of the knife handle so that it fits cleanly through the aperture in the oval shaped bolster pieces. I find it more manageable to work with 2 individual bolster layers, each consisting of 2 layers of these little cardstock rings. But if you would like to glue all 4 of them together, there's no reason why not, and you could treat them as a single unit rather than doing it in 2 sections like you see me doing here. It's absolutely personal preference. The bolster pieces are maneuvered into place until they rest firmly against the bulge at the base of the knife blade. And it's at this point that we can add the scales. So adhesive is applied to one side of the hilt, and the same process is repeated on the other side. At this point, I choose to go ahead with the superglue hardening process. I apply the superglue to the surface of the cardstock, and then I smooth it into the surface using a bit of plastic card. And I take care to cover every bit of exposed paper. And now I'll complete the hardening process for the handle of the serving spoon. Now that these pieces have been hardened with superglue, they're sturdy enough to begin the refining process. I'm going to be smoothing away any striations visible in the handle areas and any roughness from the surface. I use a variety of sanding tools for this process, including this electronic nail drill with a ceramic tip, emery boards, and fine grit sandpaper. I work on all sides of each of the pieces until they're smooth to the touch. Next, I'm going to work on the most delicate and finicky of the serving pieces, and that is the serving fork. It's created using the exact same techniques, but it does require a very delicate touch due to the very narrow tines at the end of the fork. These have a tendency to want to separate, and so it's important to press them into place using the tips of some fine point tweezers. The rest of the construction follows exactly the same processes that we used for both the serving spoon and the carving knife. A slight curve is added, and then the superglue hardening process takes place. This piece too is smoothed to the very best of my ability, and additional superglue is added to help it retain strength because it is so delicate. Once I'm satisfied with the level of refinement, I turn my attention to going over the other serving pieces that have been created and I spend a lot of time refining the blade of the carving knife so that it forms a smooth tapered blade. Next, I turn my attention to creating the individual settings. Now, there are 6 individual eating knives and 6 individual prickers. A pricker was the precursor in medieval Europe to the modern fork, and people would routinely carry this sort of spiked instrument with them and use it much as we use a fork. All of these pieces are created using the same exact methods that were outlined when creating the larger serving pieces. So the blades and hilts are layered together. Bolsters are then positioned onto the base of each blade or pricker, and then superglue is applied to all areas of each of these tiny implements. At this point, superglue hardening is applied to both of the serving platters and to all 6 of the circular trenchers. You can do this, of course, at any time you like after construction of these items is complete. I just chose this moment because it seemed like a good break in the action from my working process. As you can see, I rely heavily on these fine-tipped tweezers to help me secure each of these tiny, lightweight pieces while I'm applying the superglue. It really cuts down on mishaps with glued fingers, and the use of this needle-tipped bottle is very helpful as well. So now all of these pieces have been hardened on the upper surface. I flip them over and repeat the hardening process on the back sides of each of the serving platters and the trenchers. Now it's time to begin creating the bases for the goblets. These bases are created from 4 layers of cardstock. 3 of these rosette shapes have a square aperture in the center that represents the diameter of a standard wooden toothpick. There's one shape that does not have that aperture, and it's placed on the bottom of each stack for a clean finish. These are glued together and then hardened with superglue. At this point, I'm going to create the glass part of each goblet using pull-apart gelatin capsules and bead caps. There are the bases that we just completed, and here are some wooden toothpicks that I'm going to cut into 1/2-inch increments to represent the stem of each goblet. Once the toothpick has been cut to length, I refine it by sanding, and then it can be placed into the perfectly sized aperture on the base and glued into place. I then use a variety of beads to dress up the shaft of each of the goblets. And then I place a bead cap at the very top. This is what will hold the clear gelatin capsule component. I wasn't certain if this would work, but I'm very pleased to tell you that it works beautifully. A few drops of UV resin serves to approximate liquid in each of the glasses, and it also adds weight to the base, making it much easier to balance these tiny little pieces. Next, it's time to apply a finishing treatment to all of the wonderful little pieces that you've created. I chose to begin the process by using a brown acrylic Kraft paint thinned with do-it-yourself coffee stain, and I added this as a dark wash over all of the pieces, including the bases to each of the goblets. Next, I'm going to be adding some bronze tinted acrylic paint to highlight the areas of the goblets that I want to appear metallic. I do my best to be meticulous in my application of the paint, and I'm using a very fine-tipped brush for this process. But the undercoating of dark wash helps to disguise any areas that I might miss. I decided to add metallic highlights to the hilts of the serving pieces and to all of the little individual eating knives, etc. The initial coat of paint here is quite garish looking to my eye, and so I will be applying some more aging techniques over the top in order to knock back the harshness of that brass paint. I'm also using a little bit of the metallic brushed iron metallic wax in order to simulate the look of aged and tarnished silver on the metallic parts of the individual pieces of servingware. I use a tiny piece of dense foam to apply the metallic wax to the surfaces, and I end up using several layers of the wax. Now I'm going to apply a rim of metallic color to each of the goblets by simply tapping the upper edges against a paint-soaked sponge. This is a much more efficient way for someone like me who doesn't have a very steady hand to apply a thin and uniform line of color. I also use this paint-impregnated sponge to make certain that the edges of the platters and the plates have a nice metallic coating. And now I'm using a thinned down version of an antique gold metallic paint to give a slight metallic gloss to the surfaces of the serving platters. Next, I'm coming back in with a watery version of black acrylic paint to darken the edges of the bolsters and to create aging onto the faux metallic parts of each piece. I couldn't resist and decided that I wanted to add rhinestones onto the hilts of each of the little serving pieces. And of course, once I got started, I couldn't stop. So the goblets got that treatment as well. Having access to the pen version of the Zig two-way adhesive and this wax rhinestone picking tool speeds this process up considerably. As usual, I got carried away and I decided that the hilts of all of the individual eating implements required jewels as well. And if that's the case, then why not add jewels to the edges of the serving platters? I know, it's too much. I can't help it. I never cease to be amazed at what can be created with a little ingenuity, a single sheet of 8.5 by 11 cardstock, and the Cricut Maker. I've worked with several other types of electronic cutting machines over the years, but the Cricut Maker is capable of cutting the most delicate shapes cleanly, and for that, it will always have my loyalty and my gratitude because it's expanded my personal creative horizons in ways I could never have anticipated a year ago. For that, I am grateful. I hope that you are able to make use of this free SVG bundle to enhance your own miniature work. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Until next time, bye.